All right, everybody, welcome to week 3, and this week we're going to be talking about content strategy. So you've probably heard this quote before, which is that content is king, and I'm hoping as we go through this lecture and start to piece things together on how community management actually works in real time, that you'll start to see that context is actually even more important. So this is a topic that Gary Vaynerchuk has revisited a number of times, and what he said was that you want to give people something that they want because it helps to build up your relationship to allow you to ask for the sale. So I've shared his most recent iteration of this article from 2016 in Blackboard, but in it he makes 3 main points. So to respect the platform and the audience, that people are on different platforms for different reasons. So if we think back to the assignment from last week where we looked at our community crushes, one of the things I asked you to keep in mind was this idea of cross-platform content and what that looks like for the brands that you love. So for example, people are on Twitter for a totally different reason than they are on Pinterest, and you have to keep that in mind when you're curating content for them. Next, he says, don't interrupt the experience. So you have to think from the perspective of your audience. Are they willing to waste their time, even a few seconds, watching your video? You need to bring them into the experience you're creating by giving them value. Finally, he says to be consistent and be self-aware. So literally everything that you post becomes part of your brand, and as a result, it needs to reflect back to that brand that you're trying to build. So if you don't know who Gary Vaynerchuk is, he's a pretty dynamic and interesting speaker. If you do a quick Google search, there's tons of talks by him, definitely more on the entrepreneur and motivational speaker side, but I think this point, specifically those 3 points that he made, are super relevant when you're trying to do community management. So remember that while content may be king, context is actually God. So when we start thinking about content, it's all about these 2 key attributes. So you need your content to be relevant, and you also need it to be valuable. Specifically, your content needs to have a purpose. So don't just create it to fill a space or to hit a certain number of posts each week. Post it because you're trying to convey a specific message or you're trying to talk to a specific demographic. Let's say you post something and you get a bunch of likes, but none of them are the right audience. That doesn't necessarily accomplish the goal that you had for the content you're putting out there. It's like if you paint a picture and the only person who says that they like it is your mom. That doesn't necessarily help you if you're trying to get more people seeing it and talking about it. And I know I said this in the first lecture, but it's like that saying, if a tree falls in the forest and no one's around to hear it, does it make a sound? If a piece of content is posted and it doesn't achieve your objectives, does it actually help you in your strategy? If you think about it from an analytics perspective, it isn't that helpful really if you have 10,000 hits. If those people come to the page and bounce right away, it doesn't really accomplish the same thing as having half as many people who are maybe repeat visitors or spend a lot of time on your site and they click through to multiple things. So in that way, less can actually sometimes be more. So I wanted to share this, this sort of 9 challenges of social media marketing. And to no one's surprise, this is another great resource from Buffer that I wanted to share. So they've come up with 9 of the biggest challenges that you're going to face in social media marketing. And I have to agree because I've actually encountered all of these at one point or another. So the first challenge is creating that authentic connection to your audience. So how do we humanize the brands that we're representing in a way that makes people feel connected to us? How are we creating a social media marketing strategy? So this goes back to what we talked about last week. We can't do anything without a plan, and luckily this week we're getting into the nitty-gritty on how to do that. 3, coming up with consistently good content. So staying creative and original is one of the biggest challenges in social media management. How can we do this without it consuming all of our time? Creating content isn't the only thing you do as a community manager, so it's really important to find the right balance. 4, again, this idea of content quantity over quality. So I'm a big believer in having a good understanding of who your brand is and what you're trying to accomplish before setting the number of times that you want to be posting every day. And I think for some brands, posting a lot can actually work really well. whereas for some it will more or less isolate your audience. So for example, if you're running social media for a blog or a newspaper, you need to be posting pretty constantly. If you do anything that touches on breaking news, obviously you don't want to be posting every 5 or 6 hours. Whereas if you're running social for a company that sells vacuum cleaners, that same tactic probably isn't going to work. So this kind of goes back a little bit to dealing with people maybe within your company or within your organization who have the opinion that, more is better, and I tend to actually think that that's not necessarily true in the majority of cases. So number 5, getting your content to a large social audience. So you've got your content all worked out, but now who's going to look at it? So figuring out how to promote that content, getting eyeballs on it is a whole other challenge, one that might actually involve some paid ads, cross-promotion with other brands, and the like. So 6, finding ways to encourage sharing on social. Sometimes you've figured out how to make great content, you've grown your audience, and then you just get stuck in a rut. Suddenly people aren't sharing your content anymore, and it's time to brainstorm. Maybe if you've just been posting quotes on your Instagram account, it's time to give them a bit of a creative boost. And, I think this is a good way for you to sort of rethink what you're doing and maybe pivot if you need to. So 7, using data to back your intuition. This is definitely something that I've been guilty of because when you're in it every day, it can feel like you just know things about your audience. But these sort of anecdotal or gut feelings aren't necessarily the right route. And you're always going to want to back those up with some data so that you can make sure that you're making the right decision if you need to change your strategy. And again, like if you're reporting to someone above you saying, I just can tell, isn't really the most encouraging. So number 8, creating quality visuals and graphics. So visual content is so important. In fact, it's up to 40 times more likely to be shared. So that means figuring out how to create good visual content is actually crucial to your social plan. There's never really been a better time to invest in this than when you're making your plan. So for example, if you're not a graphic designer or you don't have the tools at your disposal to make your own visual content, you need to think about who will be making that, how you're going to get that from them, and what those costs are like. And the best time to think about that is before you're actually in the thick of it. You don't want to have committed to putting up 5, illustrations a week and you actually don't have an illustrator for them. So lastly, you want to focus on the things that matter the most. And so this goes back to the previous slide and last week's lecture, but you do really need to focus on the things that matter the most. It takes a lot of work to build your brand up, so you need to be going back to those brand pillars and creating relevant and valuable content to build up your following. So thinking about community management, just in general, I kind of wanted to pivot a little bit from that and say that there are some traits that really make for good community management. And I say traits because a skill is something you can learn. You can learn how to use Twitter, you can learn how to use Google Analytics, but for example, knowing how to have a sense of humor isn't something that you can read in a book or get out of a class. It either comes from inside you or it comes in time as you learn to be an effective community manager. And I think all of these things go back to our first lecture. If you want to be dealing with the public, even if it's not in real life, and even if it's just online, I think you really need to understand how to interact with people. And so when you're creating your content and when you're thinking about your content strategy, I think keeping these kinds of things in mind is really important. So how are you going to be empathetic? How are you going to be clear and concise and professional? How are you going to focus? How are you going to resolve but not inflame conversations? How are you going to stay level-headed? How are you going to have a sense of humor about things? How are you going to be authoritative on your subject and on your brand? And how are you going to be savvy? So thinking back to what we talked about last week, I really want to drive this point home of strategy before content, because you can't do anything without a plan. And I get it, because content creation and sharing things and engaging with people online is actually the most fun part of doing community management, but all of that work can't happen unless you have a strategy in place. And it's really easy to forget this, so I want everyone to constantly, remind themselves of this until it sticks. So your strategy has to come before your content. We're going to get into that a little bit now, so hopefully you'll see what I mean. Okay, so again, strategy before content. So when we're putting together our strategy, you need to look at a few things. You need to look at your objectives, your purpose, your brand voice, your audience, and your channels and pathways. When you're making a strategy, you want to think of what your objective is for all of your content. Think about what you're trying to accomplish by being on social media. Similarly, you need to determine your purpose. Is it to inform people? Is it to make them laugh? Whatever it is, that's the core of your strategy, and everything you put out there needs to have this objective and purpose in mind. So next is your brand voice. And I think this might actually be the most important, and I think I've probably said this before. But you want your brand to be identifiable online. You want to create such a distinct voice that people just know it's you. As part of creating your brand identity and pillars, getting that brand voice is right in there. And so for me, especially when I'm taking on a new role, I sort of print out what this brand voice is and look at it constantly until I know it inside out. Because it's really easy to slip into your own voice, especially if in your personal life you're an avid social media user. It's also really easy to try something new, but the voice is actually really integral to your strategy, and it's important to continue to hone it. And if you make a decision to move away from the voice that your company or your organization has chosen, it's actually a larger thing and can't just be done like in a one-off because you've decided that you want to try something new in a week. So remember last week when we talked about user personas? Your brand voice is actually really similar. It's based on research and objectives, so knowing, what that is and who you're trying to reach is really, really helpful and really important. So next is your audience. So your audience means understanding why you're doing what you do and who's looking for it. Your audience are the people who are following you on Twitter and subscribing to your newsletters, and they're also who you're trying to gain as an audience. So not necessarily people who follow you already, but your target of people that you're looking for. So it kind of falls into two categories. And last are your channels and pathways. So I know it's really easy to think that you need to do all of the things when you are launching social media channels, but it really needs to be specific to your brand. Does it make sense to be on Pinterest if you're a vacuum company? Maybe not. Does it make sense to be on Instagram if you're providing a service and not a product? Again, maybe not. And having a strategy in place where you understand your audience and your objective will actually help you narrow these down so that you're targeting the right demographic on the right channel every time. So one of the links that we are going to be looking at this week is a really great presentation from Moz, M-O-Z. And if you aren't familiar with them, they put out a lot of great stuff, especially on content marketing and SEO. I highly recommend taking a look through the rest of the site when you have a chance. And so this week I'm posting a slide deck from Rand Fishkin, who talks about why content marketing often fails. And so while I'm not going to go through the entire document in this lecture, I think he does a really interesting and approachable, fun way to talk about these things. And so before next week, I'd actually like you to go through the whole presentation. So the next two slides are things that I really like because I think it highlights a big challenge that arises in social media marketing and definitely can be a challenge when you're putting together your strategy depending on what kind of people you're reporting to. So remember in the first lecture when we talked about analytics and numbers and how sometimes people are asking for things that they don't actually understand and that don't actually matter? Well, the same mode of thinking can be applied here. So some people think of strategy as really linear. You make the content, people engage, and then they support your product or brand. But in reality, it actually isn't that simple. It really more looks like this. So you make your content, people click on it, and if they like it, maybe they like your page, they might come back. And then when you follow the arrow, you see at the bottom that maybe they do visit again because, you have new content that's coming out every once in a while and they like that content too. And then maybe them liking that content helps to build trust and relationship with you and with your brand. And then maybe when it is time for them to find a product or service, you're who they go with because they've built a relationship with you and you've provided value to them. So again, like I said, it's kind of like a fun presentation that he puts together. Here he is dressed as Fred Flintstone. But I think what he says is really important. So content marketing is about earning familiarity, trust, and relationships. So do you remember this from last week? You want to keep this idea of relationships and trust central to everything you do. When you're making your strategy, when you're posting content, it should all center on trust. And so, as we've been talking about, week over week, at the heart of everything we do is community, both online and in real life. You want to make content for your marketing personas because you want them to be reflected in the work that you're doing and they want to feel seen by your brand. And this isn't about using your brand voice when you're putting your content together. It's, say looking at the girl in the green dress in the photo, figuring out what her marketing persona is and talking to her in that brand voice. Figuring out how to answer her questions and solve her problems. So earlier in this lecture, I mentioned that a challenge in social media marketing is this idea of quantity over quality. And I think it's generally a good rule of thumb. So it's pretty normal to want to dump a lot of content out at once. But that's not actually very sustainable in the long run, and it's not necessarily effective. So one of the biggest things with this is the potential to spend a lot of time creating content up front and then learning that it doesn't actually resonate with your audience. So if you find yourself at a huge brand or a large agency, maybe you actually can create a ton of stuff. Or again, if we think back to if you work for a news organization, you have constant content. But I still think it's important to test out what you're doing so that you aren't wasting your time. So if you make 30 pieces of content and it turns out that only 5 of those resonated with your audience, you have 25 pieces of content that are essentially just garbage. So again, if we think back to last week's theory, it's important to be creating content with some regularity. So if you want people to be coming back and you want them to engage with you, they need to know when to expect new stuff from you and to know that you are putting stuff out relatively regularly. So next, you want to have content that is value-driven. So this is your purpose, ensuring that it's relevant to your audience and is audience-driven. So just talking about yourself and your agenda all the time is one-sided, and as we saw last week, it needs to be a two-way street. You also want to be transparent and accountable. So if you're posting user-generated content, you need to give it kudos, for example. But you also need to be accountable because, as we've talked about, what you post online becomes your brand as soon as it's out there, and you no longer have control over that entire conversation. And of course, you want to have empathy. This is all about being human, and it's about understanding that you're dealing in human interaction and trying to understand who's on the other side of that computer screen. Okay, so how do we put all of this together? Let's build our content strategy. So the first step for creating your content strategy is doing an internal audit. And you're doing this to understand who you are, what your objectives are, and who you're going to be talking to and trying to talk to. An internal audit looks closely at your existing business model. And I think this is really important and needs to go hand in hand with your content strategy. How do you bring in revenue? Which of your products bring in the most revenue? And why certain products need assistance in marketing, who uses those products, what kinds of things have you done in the past. All of these things matter while you're creating content, and you need to take stock of them before you can start so that you have an informed strategy. If you make a strategy that's entirely based off of, promoting a product that it turns out doesn't actually need help being sold or that's being discontinued, then again, you've created a whole strategy on something that isn't reflective of what's actually happening in your company. So the other thing you want to do in an internal audit is look at your existing customers. So who's your base and what do you know about them? Depending on what size of company you're at, you might actually already have market research. And this is really good because it gives you a handle on how and where your existing customers have come from. And this is the kind of research that we talked about last week with your personas. So it's possible that your company's already done this. You have your brand voice, you have your brand strategy, you have your pillars, you have your market research, your viability studies, all of that. But if you don't have that, you're actually going to have to collect your own research. So the last thing is that you're going to want to understand your existing brand strategy. So like I said, if there's already these documents developed, or even if it's just an editorial guideline of here's the kinds of things that we post, All of those things can help you figure out what your social media presence should look like, and it helps you figure out how you're going to align them within those existing things. So just understanding how things work within your own organization and department is really important. So we talked a little bit previously about how social is often just one part of marketing. So understanding how the rest of that department works and how it works in the larger, being of the company is really important. So, how does content get approved? Who approves it? What kinds of guidelines are set? Whose role is it to produce the content? Is that your role? You need to know all of those things when you put together your strategy. Step 2. So information gathering. I'm sure that sounds pretty similar to an internal audit, but this time think of it as an external audit. So there's going to be a bit of overlap in this slide from last week, so I won't spend too much time on this. But this step happens after you have a really clear picture of what's going on within your own organization. And once you have that, you're ready to see how you stack up against your competitors. And you want to know what your competitors are doing. Specifically, you want to know what their voice is like, what kind of content they produce, how often they're posting. And it's pretty easy to figure these things out just by creeping around on their pages. You can actually learn a lot. You can see that if their average post is getting around 200 likes and suddenly a post has 1,000 likes, it's pretty likely that they've put some advertising money behind that, which means it's an important part of their business that they're trying to boost. And you can kind of just think to yourself what that might mean. So are they posting it because they're having trouble selling it? Are they posting it because it does really well and they're trying to push it? Either way, you know that it's an important part of their business just from doing that quick kind of creep on their Facebook page. So the other thing that you can do is compare and contrast how your competitors are ranking in keyword searches. So say you're trying to find the best hot chocolate in Toronto, you want to Google that exact term to see where your competitors are ranking. So understanding this sort of surface level of SEO can be really helpful for you down the line when you start making content. If a common search term is where to buy real hot chocolate powder in Toronto, and you're going to be selling hot chocolate powder, you want to consider what kind of content you're going to make and how you're going to get it to appear in a Google search result. And so in keyword research, you can get a sense for what people are searching, and that helps you figure out how to answer their questions. And it also helps you see what your competitors maybe aren't doing and to identify gaps, because you're able to then see on your competitor's website like how they've structured their pages. Do they have landing pages? Do they have pieces of content? And it really gives you an opportunity to see where you can improve on things. And so this last point is kind of dependent on your company. Like I said, if you've already got market research, you've probably got customer surveys. And if you're at a large company, consider this sort of taken care of in step 1. And if not, it's a conversation worth having with your sort of head of department about what kind of money you might have available to you to do some research on your own. So whether it's a market research study or some customer surveys, if you can do this kind of research, it's really helpful. There's also sometimes some surveys and trend reports that have already been done. And kind of depending on your industry, you might be able to find something that's helpful for you. So you're just going to want to dig around and see what's out there. Okay, step 3, analyze and plan. So this part gets really interesting because this is where you start to determine what your goals are with your content. So are you trying to get leads or gather information or convert your people to your product? With each piece that you're putting out there, whether it's a newsletter, a blog, or a tweet, these goals have to be kept in mind so that you can tailor your content appropriately. And so in order for these goals to be successful, you need to benchmark where you're at right now. How many likes do you have on your page? How quickly is your page growing? What kind of engagement do you have? Once you know how you're performing, you can start tracking growth more appropriately so that you can see with a clearer correlation that what you're doing well and not so well over time and how your actions and how your content are impacting that. So finally, you also want to audit your existing content. So I'm assuming that most of you are going to start your careers working for an existing company, which is great because it gives you an ability to audit what's already happening and to see whether or not stuff is working and find ways to tweak it. This is the thing that I do every time I take over a new account, is I just try to get a sense of what's happening to see, are we getting a lot of hits on a certain kind of post? Are we finding better times of day that work really well for our audience? Who is our audience? Just in general, that kind of step helps you figure out where it's worth investing your time going forward so that you're not kind of just putting stuff out into the ether and seeing what sticks. Okay, so this idea of where your content fits is really, really important. So I think in the next couple of slides, you're going to see how this idea of creating content, marketing personas, and like calls to action and how everything kind of comes together. So if you've worked in marketing before, or maybe in some of your other courses, you've probably heard of this funnel. So this one is from Moz. Again, like I said, it's a great resource. You should definitely just go through everything that they have out there. And so while there's lots of different variations on this funnel, I think it's an important tool to understand how your content fits within these buckets. So if you aren't familiar with the marketing funnel, the basic idea is that at the top you start with a lot of people, and as they sort of make their way through the funnel, they become more and more likely to buy and stay as your customer. And conversion rates, which is the number of people who come through the funnel and end up buying something, kind of depend on your business. And obviously this looks differently if you're working at a not-for-profit or a charity, but in general it's sort of helpful to understand what your content is trying to help people do and where in the funnel they sit. And so that's the question. Where does your content fit? So if people have never heard of you before, you're going to spend a lot of your initial time creating content to sort of reach out to this totally new audience. And your content falls into awareness because you're trying to bring awareness to your brand or your organization. This is the area where you want to be really broad with super shareable content. It's the kind of thing that brings you eyeballs to your page so that people keep coming back. And they keep coming back when you have more focused and detailed stuff. And that sort of focused and detailed stuff is called trigger. And that's where people start coming to you. It's the stage where people are taking an action versus just passively watching your page. And then people might start seeking you out. And this is where this idea of sharing metrics comes in. So if people are sharing your content, you move up on that Google page. So next is consideration. And this is content, sort of where you're really figuring out, like, what is your content doing? Is it generating a lead? Are you getting someone to sign up for a newsletter? Checking out your product page, etc. This is maybe where your content starts to include a CTA, a call to action. And so what you're trying to do is get people, if they haven't already taken an action on your page, now is the time that you want to encourage them to do so. If you've gotten them to take an action, that means that they're ready to buy something. So this is where you're going to want to ensure that you're sort of tracking and understanding when and where and how people decided to buy something on your site. And it doesn't necessarily have to be buying something. It can be if your goal is to get people to sign up for your newsletter or to sign up for an online course or to make a donation. Whatever it is that your objective is, the buying part is where they've actually done it. So you'll probably want to work with your sales team or business development team on this sort of aspect of it, but it's really important to understand where that content plays in. And then the last part is staying. So these are your loyal customers. You may remember we've talked about those evangelists, those people who come back all the time, and those are the people at the top of the funnel. Okay, so as you can see, we're back to the same question. Is your content relevant and is it valuable? So when we're looking at that funnel, we want to know where our content fits in at every stage. And it needs to be both of these things at every stage. And especially for content that goes further down the funnel, you want to make sure that it's well curated, that it has metrics associated with it, and that everything is honed and is really relevant and valuable, because those are the stages where it's the easiest to lose someone. So if someone's followed you down that path, it's pretty easy for them to turn around, and you have a much smaller number to play with. So if you start with 50, by the time you're at consideration, you maybe have 10 people. So every person counts, and having that relevant and valuable content is what helps lead them through the next 2 stages of the funnel. Speaking of the funnel, here it is again. So in addition to understanding where your content fits, you actually also want to understand where those personas that you've created fit also. And you want to put your personas into each of these different conversion levels, and you want to be writing for each of these personas at each of these levels. And so how you write for someone at each stage of the funnel is going to be different, and it's going to be different for each type of person that you're hoping to target. I think this stage can be really confusing because it's hard to imagine using your brand voice to write for all of these different people at all of these different stages. But you are your voice, and you can make content that fits your brand and fits your personas at each of these levels while still retaining your objectives. So if we go back to Cheddar Kathy from last week, we would want to make a piece of content for her at each stage of the funnel. An awareness piece that lets her know who we are, a trigger piece, a search piece so that she can find us, a consideration piece that pushes her to make a choice toward our product, and then after she's purchased it, how we can keep her around to continue coming to us for all of her cheese needs. I think the example I used last week was that she likes buying our product because we always have recipes that people can access with. Okay, step 4. So this isn't necessarily the sexiest step in making a content plan, but it is so crucial. So step 4 is really an emphasis on planning. So this is especially important if you're working as a team or working with content creators. You need to know who is involved in the creation of content, when they get brought in to make decisions, and why they're involved. So are you setting the topic for a piece and assigning it to someone, or are they pitching you a piece of content? That changes your process. Some of the people who might be on your teams are a designer who's helping to make visuals, the decision maker who decides what does and doesn't get posted, the content creator that's making the thing you want to share, or the SEO person who's maybe coaching you on what kind of content you need. So keep in mind that you aren't necessarily the only person involved in this process. In fact, you might not be involved at all, so someone might be telling you what your role is in this plan. And either way, understanding how everyone's role fits together in the plan is crucial for success. So knowing who creates, who edits, who posts, who illustrates, these are all the things you need to know before you can make a plan, and it's important that every role in that process understand where they fit too. So next, you have defining those roles. So if you're the person who's doing the posting, but Alex is the one writing the content, and Aaron is the one editing it, but Sam is the person designing it, and Sarah is who signs off on it before posting, then you need to know how that chain works and where you fit in it. You also need to know how long that process takes so that you can plan accordingly. And this is really a group discussion because maybe you think it only takes a couple of hours for Sam to design something, but in reality, Sam needs, 2 full days to do the design. And talking about this is how you get everyone on the same page. Okay, so this is the best part, step 5, which is creating and promoting the heck out of the content that you're making. So that's actually what we're going to talk about for the rest of the lecture. But before we do that, I just want to mention that the step after that is analyze. And so in week 5, we're actually going to dig a bit deeper into this aspect. So analyzing the content is a key piece, and it does deserve its own time to shine. So even though it technically comes after creating and promoting, we're going to save it for a later lecture. So back to content. Again, we want to ask ourselves, is our content relevant and is it valuable? So you're probably sitting there thinking, geez, Siobhan, how many times do you need to say this? And the answer is a lot, because it's actually so important. Unique, relatable, interesting content that people actually want to read and share needs to make them feel a certain way. They need to feel excited and happy about that content. Nothing is worse than when you follow a brand that you really like, only to discover that they actually just recycle their content all the time, or that they're just posting a lot of clickbait content, or that a lot of the stuff you've seen over and over again from other brands. And it's really that moment where you say, this isn't what I signed up for, and you tend to unlike the page or unfollow the account. So people tend to do a lot of weird stuff with their content writing, and you'll see that sometimes people change the way that they write posts based on, say, new SEO rules or Facebook algorithms, but that can actually really mess with the meat of the content and can ultimately move you away from those two really important things of being relevant and valuable. So yeah, maybe you change some stuff behind the scenes or the format, but never take on a new writing style just because a platform has made a bunch of changes. It might make Google happy, but it's not going to make your customer base happy. So there's four types of content out there, and I often think that the best practice is having a mix of all four. I'd like to think of it like a trail mix. So the first type is created content, and this is the content that you're producing in-house. So whether you're producing it with a team or by yourself, it's yours and it belongs to your brand. So it should be written in your brand voice, even if it was made by someone else for your brand. So if your team didn't edit, write, and design it, then for sure you had the editorial direction on it to ensure it's something that aligns with your pillars and is relevant and valuable to your customers. The next type is licensed content, and I can guarantee that you've encountered this somewhat regularly. Usually you'll see a small note saying where this thing is sourced from. So maybe it's the Canadian Press or a newswire, or it's sponsored content. This is something that I ran into a lot when I worked at iVillage, where our content on iVillage would be reposted onto MSN. So this also happens a lot with bloggers on places like Huffington Post, where someone has paid to have their content there, and when you click through, it actually takes you to their own site. And depending on where you put this, it can be a slam dunk because you're getting their metrics on a much more highly read website, and you're able to cross-post it to your own blog and get your own traffic there. Licensed content can be a really great thing when you're trying to build your brand, or if there's someone in your organization that you want to build up as a thought leader or as an expert in the field, which ultimately is another great way to bring people back to your site. The next type is curated content, and I like to think of this as your halo. So these are topics and events and writers that are relevant to your brand, but that are not necessarily, and actually in fact are not written by you or hosted on your website. So this is something I do all the time in small organizations because it helps to lessen the content creation load by sharing relevant and interesting pieces of content to your followers from other relevant and valuable sources. And this is really more for social media only. If you think your followers will find a link relevant or valuable to them, then definitely share those links. And the good news is that you're still collecting metrics, so you know when things are performing well and when they aren't, and you'll learn if posting these kinds of links work well for your audience. So the last type of content is user-generated, and this usually has a huge spectrum, and it can be really interesting and super useful. So I mentioned this in the first week's assignment about the contests, because a lot of times you'll see brands running a contest where someone has to take a photo or tell a story using a hashtag, and the brand will retweet or share that to their followers. And so it could be working with an influencer to create content for you about your product or service. You've probably seen a lot of blog posts that have like a well-known blogger or Instagram celebrity who comes and shoots photos of their products or of themselves using the product and writes up an interesting little review. And so in this type of user-generated content, you have control over what gets created because you have a say. If you're, say, like a food company and you say to someone, okay, we're going to give you this food for free and we'd like you to write an article, and here's, how we want the product to look, that kind of ensures that you're getting your points in, but you're getting content made for you that your readers and followers are going to like. So think of it this way, it's content that we haven't produced, but that we get to use. So if we go back to this idea of looking at these four content types as trail mix, there's really no perfect number for how many of each you need. Sometimes you pull a handful of raisins, and sometimes it's an evenly mixed handful between all four parts. But if you think of it that way, you probably don't want a handful of raisins, you want a variety. And of course, some of this might not work for you, and you might need to be strategic about what you're doing. And I don't think 100% of one type of content is the right move. So variety is the spice of life. And it doesn't have to necessarily be an equal measure from all four sides. If you don't have the funds for licensed content or you don't think user-generated content will fit on your brand, that's totally okay too. So I just want to quickly go through this graph of the different kinds of content you'll be dealing with. And you can see at the top, suspects, leads, opportunities. That sort of fits into that funnel that we were talking about earlier. So in the first column, you have your social posts, so your tweets, your videos, infographics, whatever you're putting out onto your channels. And this is usually curated, created, licensed, or user-generated content. The idea here is getting your awareness and your trigger posts. So something that is elevating your public-facing stuff, but is still relevant and engaging. Next, you have your website and other online platforms, like your blog or your newsletter. And this is either created or licensed content. Again, this is either content that you've created or that you've purchased to put up on your site, and the idea here is to drive traffic or a purchase, and it should be in your own brand voice, speaking to the people you want to be speaking to. Last is your direct content. This is created and user-generated content, but I think that created works really well here, and this is because it's an opportunity for you to tell your story, to sort of toot your own horn, and to show people what kind of value you bring and how happy people are with your services or your product. So this can be an in-person or a webinar or a demo of a product, but it's where you're trying to sell something. So this is the buy and sell part of that funnel. Think of it as closing the deal and making these members of your community loyal members. Surprise, look who's back. So again, just a reminder that whenever you're making decisions about the kind of content you want to be using, keep these two things in mind. How does your content tie back to your overarching goals? It has to go back to your values, your goals, your brand pillars. It has to make sense, and so there has to be a purpose behind everything that you're posting. So speaking of having a purpose, content has to serve a purpose, and it needs to relate back to your marketing personas. Your content can do any of these things. It can inform someone, it can teach someone something new, it can inspire them to take an action, it can entertain them, it can persuade them to buy something or start a conversation or spark a controversy, although I don't know why you would want to do that. It can express an opinion, or it can share industry knowledge or resources, but whatever it does, it has to relate back to those overarching goals and back to your personas. There has to be, something that gives it a reason to be on your feed, because if there isn't, it's not going to help you. The money and time that you're putting into making what's essentially irrelevant content could be better spent somewhere else. So, with all of this in mind, what's your plan? To me, the simplest way to figure out what your plan is to go through all of these steps and to create a master social document. So for a lot of people in community management and marketing in general, I find that it's a lot easier to just create a master sort of spreadsheet, and that's really the best way to stick your content strategy in and to ensure that you're hitting all of your key points. So this plan is seen sort of as like an editorial calendar. It's often a color-coded Excel document that lets you see the types of content you're posting, what keywords you want to hit, when you want it to go out, and what kind of media it is. And there's so many good templates available online, and next week we're going to go and do some finding of these tools and using them ourselves, just to see how to find a good template, how to fill it out, and get all those practical skills that we want. So the important thing about creating something like this is that it's likely to be shared, and this kind of high-level, detailed, color-coordinated spreadsheet is great for when your higher-ups or client wants to see your work and wants to see what your plan is. By the time you've gotten to this stage of your social plan, you've done so much work to get yourself situated. You've done your internal audits, your research, you know your brand voice and your purpose, and this master document helps you execute this. Because after all, that's what community managers do. They execute a strategy. So let's talk about some things that you'd want to include in your editorial calendar. These are all the little content pieces that fit into your larger sort of strategy. They're, a piece of your company or your organization's larger integrated marketing and communications initiatives. And this is something that we've talked a bit about last week, making sure that the look and feel is the same regardless of where in your marketing plan it comes from, print, social media, online, it all needs to sound the same. So what kind of stuff should we include in an editorial calendar? You're going to want to have any corporate blogs or content pieces that you've produced. You want those halo pieces, so if you're constantly retweeting the same 5 sources, you're going to want to schedule those. You're going to want to have some social for your company and sponsored events, scheduled newsletters when they're going out, scheduled mailers when they're going out. Anytime that you're doing promotions, prizes, or offers, you're going to want to schedule those. And then any type of social media contest and challenge. So just some things that you might want to note in an editorial calendar is that it's not just your article names and what content bucket it falls into. This document is your arsenal to know all of the ways that you can maximize your presence on social media. So, for example, you might want to include, themes of the month or the week. So whether that's like a throwback Thursday or a motivation Monday, or it's, a silly holiday like National Hot Dog Day or Earth Day or Easter, you're going to want to know when all of these things fall so that you can plan accordingly, because nothing is worse than realizing that it's the week of Thanksgiving and you haven't actually thought of a content plan for that. The other thing you're going to want to note is your calls to action. So think of this as your purpose. Are you trying to capture a lead or inform someone? Do you want them to sign up for a newsletter or go to your website or share your post? So just make a note that you're spreading your various CTAs out over the course of the calendar so things don't get too repetitive. And then sort of obvious, but you want to note where these things are being posted, so what channels and pathways they're going onto. And then next you want to put your expected outcomes. So if you expect a post to get 500 likes, put that down. These outcomes should be informed by research, and they should sort of give you an idea of what you think you can achieve. And this is especially helpful when you work with clients, so that you have an idea of what you're going to be reporting back to them, and then you can give them this idea of your expected outcome versus reality. And I think it's also helpful because it helps you plan your next campaign. It helps you look back and say, what else can we improve? What didn't we do? What should we try and do differently next time? So last, you're going to want to have your assets listed, so where you can find those, because again, really, really frustrating when a post is supposed to be scheduled and you're trying to scramble for a photo because you don't actually know where the designer has put it. So I just want to talk quickly about the first part of your major assignment because we're already in week 3. And so part 1 of the project is the framework for your community management plan. And basically what you're doing is the first part of the major assignment informs what happens in the second part. And so this is a pretty big assignment. It's out of 40 marks. So I just want to make sure that you're putting a lot of detail into this. And I want to make sure that you're on the right track for the second part of the assignment. So after you submit it, I'll give it back to you with feedback and comments so that you are on track. So what you're going to want to do is pick a brand that you're creating this plan for. So this should be someone that you're already working with. So maybe it's a not-for-profit you love, or somebody that you want to represent and create a plan for. So identifying what kind of business they are, why you've chosen them, just give me some detail. Then I want to see what their business objectives are. And so this can be hard if you're not already working for the company, but if you dig, it's definitely out there. So if you find the brand, go to their About Us page. They might have annual reports or interviews with the CEO that will help you find what those things are. Next, I want you to define the community's purpose. So why do you have a community and what does the community do for your fans? Then I want you to define your brand voice. And this is pretty fun. There's a website called voiceandtone.com, which is an awesome tool that helps you sort of dig deeper than that little 4-square thing we looked at last week. And I think it might be a good starting point to help you continue to wrap your head around the idea of creating a voice and what kind of words I'm looking for you to use when you describe them. So again, really important to make sure you have a solid brand voice. And then I want you to define your audience, so who they are, what they do, what their demographic is, how do they identify, just a little bit more about your audience. And then finally, I want you to figure out who your key competitors are, so who provides a similar product or service. And I want at least 3 or more if you can find them. And if you can't find 3 competitors, then you're going to need to pick a different brand because that's really the only way for you to get experience doing this. Okay, so I will talk to you all next week. I will see you in the Facebook group, and feel free to post anything that you have questions about there. Talk to you soon.